Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Harry Truman, and the focus is Senator from Pendergast. The year is 1935. That was a derogatory moniker associated with Truman, the new senator from Missouri. Basically, he was thought to be there in Washington to do the bidding of boss Tom Pendergast, who ran the political machine in and around the Kansas City area, who helped get him elected. And he was getting the cold shoulder from both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue because of this consideration. He said at first, "I was not very comfortable at all. I was under a cloud. I did not see Roosevelt alone until I had been in Washington for 6 months." So what did he do? He got to work. He got up before dawn every day. Well, that was typical for Truman, but not most other folks. In fact, they had to give him his own pass key eventually, so he didn't have to keep finding somebody to let him into the office on Capitol Hill. He got a ton of work done in the morning. Very studious about all of the issues of the day, got a lot of correspondence done. Then everybody showed up, and he started to get to work with them. It's actually a very reliable vote for the Roosevelt administration and still pushing his New Deal. Truman believed in this stuff. Social Security Act, the Wagner Labor Relations Act. He even supported Roosevelt's bid when he decided to try to pack the Supreme Court, which did not go well, but Truman was in his corner. What did this get him? Not very much. And most of the patronage coming to Missouri, well, that was all going to the senior senator from the state, Bennett. Not a lot coming for Truman. And then Truman and the Roosevelt administration actually got crosswise a little bit. This was after Joe Robinson died. He was the Senate Majority Leader, and there was a race between Pat Harrison and Alben Barkley for that job. Truman said he was going to support Harrison. Roosevelt wanted Barkley. But instead of trying to lobby Truman to maybe change his vote and come over to his side, called Tom Pendergast. And in a rare time, Pendergast made that phone call to Harry Truman to try to say if maybe he would change his vote. Truman told him no. He said, "Look, I just can't do it, Tom, and I'll tell you why. I've given my word to Pat Harrison." What else did he do, though? Well, he was irked. He was really annoyed at the White House. Why didn't they just call him directly? Eventually, he sent a message to the White House. "I'm tired of being pushed around, tired of having the president treat me like an office boy." Well, what was he going to do? He really felt he had to work his way out of this, and he did that in his committee work, particularly in the Interstate Commerce Committee. The chair of that committee was Burton of Montana, and Wheeler actually took kindly to Truman. He appreciated and sort of began to trust him. His work ethic was really impressive, and they started to work together on some legislation, like the Civil Aeronautics Act. And this was not sexy legislation. It was a lot of work behind the scenes, but Truman got into it. It was needed. They needed a foundational oversight construct for the civilian aeronautics industry. They passed this legislation. It would last really in place for about the next couple of decades, so it was a good start to getting some work done for Truman. He and Wheeler continued to work together. The next was the Railroad Transportation Act, sometimes called the Wheeler-Truman Act, investigating some of the financial health of the industry of the railroads. And again, hard work behind the scenes, a lot of effort. And then Truman started to get a little pushback. Where? From the state of Missouri, because some of his investigators were looking into the railroads in that state, and they were trying to lobby him to say, "You know what, can you kind of look in some other direction?" And Truman said no. He told his investigative team, "I don't want you to ease up on anything. Treat this investigation just as you do all the others." Perhaps trying to demonstrate he wasn't the senator from Pendergast, he was a senator of the United States and trying to do the right thing on behalf of the American people. Well, then Tom Pendergast got into some trouble. First health, and then with the law. Had a heart attack in 1936 at the Democratic National Convention. They did some additional investigation. They found colon cancer. He had surgery, a colostomy, had a bag attached to his body really for the rest of his life. But then on the political side and on the legal side, 1936 gubernatorial election, Truman helped convince Pendergast to support Lloyd Stark for that position. Now, this would be something that Truman would later very much regret. He would say that, "I told Tom I thought Stark was an honorable man, he would make a good governor," which shows how easy it is to be fooled by your friends. Stark had neither honor nor loyalty. He should have been a member of the Spanish Inquisition or the court of Louis XI of France, but he won that race, and what did he do? He turned on Tom Pendergast, the man who helped get him elected. In fact, he claimed he had benefited from ghost votes in the Kansas City area, stuffing of the ballot boxes. Then those votes were for him, but this was a chance for him to sort of make a name for himself by going against the political machine. So we got the federal prosecutor, Maurice Milligan, to investigate those ghost votes, and also there was a claim of bribery on the table for Pendergast. Pendergast had gotten involved in some settlement claims from insurance companies against the state. He walked away with $750,000. Some were calling it a bribe. What did Milligan do? He charged him with tax evasion. Never claimed that income on his tax return. Now, Harry Truman really felt for his friend. He was hurting both physically and now was in trouble with the law. He decided to go after the prosecutor, Maurice Milligan. Milligan was nominated for another term as a prosecutor in the area. Truman took to the Senate floor to go against it. He excoriated Milligan, told people to not vote for him, and frankly, this did not play well for Harry Truman. Made him look like the senator from Pendergast, who was just doing Tom Pendergast's bidding, came across looking petty, and it didn't work. The only person to vote against Milligan was Harry Truman. Everybody else voted in favor. Milligan then took Pendergast to court. Initially, Pendergast pleaded not guilty. Came back 3 weeks later, changed his plea to guilty, threw himself on the mercy of the court, and he was convicted and got a 15-month sentence, $350,000 fine. He actually spent about just over a year in the U.S. penitentiary in Leavenworth, Kansas. Throughout all of this, though, Harry Truman stood by his friend. Tom Pendergast has always been my friend. He said, "I don't desert a sinking ship." He later added, "Tom Pendergast never asked me to do a dishonest deed. He knew I wouldn't do it. When Tom Pendergast was down and out, a convicted man, people wanted me to denounce him. I refused. I wouldn't kick a friend." Well, the first term for Harry Truman in the United States Senate was coming to a close. 1940 election was coming up. Truman had given FDR a lot of support during his term. He passed some meaningful legislation, but it created very little buzz. Still had this Pendergast thing sort of hanging over his head. Nobody thought he could win re-election. In fact, he was having difficulty raising money. There weren't a lot of people coming out to his events. So what was he going to do? Well, he was going after it. He was going to do it the hard way, campaigning aggressively, traveling the state, making his case to the voters. Kicked off that campaign in Sedalia, Missouri. Mama Truman was sitting in the front row, talked about how he had supported Franklin Roosevelt, the New Deal, also Roosevelt's foreign policy, providing arms to Britain, was trying to hold out at this point. War was underway, World War II in Europe, United States not involved yet, but Roosevelt was trying to help out the British to hold off against Hitler's Nazis who were rushing through Western Europe. But then in this speech in Sedalia, Truman also introduced something new into his campaign. He spoke about civil rights. Now, this was interesting for Truman because it was clear that he had racial biases of his own, were kind of deep-seated, that went back to the way he was raised. Racist terms were actually fairly common in his correspondence, including the N-word. He was not advancing equality in all areas for blacks, but yes, when it came to the Constitution, when it came to the Bill of Rights, all Americans were covered. Truman said at this event, "I wish to make it clear I'm not appealing for social equality for the Negroes. Negroes want justice, not social relations. I believe in the brotherhood of man, not merely the brotherhood of white men, but the brotherhood of all men before the law. I believe in the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. In giving Negroes the rights which are theirs, we are only acting in accord with our own ideals of a true democracy." It was the most forward-leaning statement Truman had ever made on the topic of civil rights. Now, the subject of incumbency does come with some advantages. A number of Truman's colleagues in the Senate came to Missouri to help kind of push his nomination forward, including the majority leader, Alben Barkley, came to speak to some folks. Interesting, the senior senator from Missouri, Bennett, originally he had nothing to do with this race. He was kind of sitting out of it. He and Truman had never really been close. But one thing he didn't want Lloyd Stark in the Senate. And Lloyd Stark was the man who was running against Truman. You know who else was running? Maurice Milligan. So an interesting threesome here trying to go for this Democratic nomination. And Clark didn't want Stark involved in the Senate, so he started to actually lobby folks on the eastern part of the state, not a strength area for Truman, to come to Truman's side. Now, Stark really probably should have been a shoo-in for this, but he was annoying people on a number of levels, in part because he couldn't focus on one particular job. Yes, he wanted to be the senator from Missouri, but he was also lobbying President Roosevelt for the job as the Secretary of the Navy, and he showed up at the National Convention that year, basically lobbying to be vice president for Roosevelt. So this was annoying some folks, but the real difference in this race, it all came back down to machine politics. Bob Hannegan, who was one of the bosses in the St. Louis area, was pushing for the candidacy of Larry McDaniel in the governor's race. Now, he wanted McDaniel to win, and so he kind of got in a deal with the Truman people. If you'll support McDaniel for governor, we'll support Truman for the Senate. And this made a big difference. When it came to that Democratic primary, no surprise that Truman won Kansas City by about 20,000 votes. But something he had never been able to do was to win in St. Louis. And that's where Hannegan delivered the votes. It put Truman over the top. This was a huge upset for Harry Truman to beat the governor, Lloyd Stark, to beat Maurice Milligan, to get that Democratic nomination. In the fall, he easily won the election over the Republican Manuel Davis. And finally, he was a politician on his own terms. He won this Senate seat on his own, a major step forward in his career. He wasn't the senator from Pendergast anymore. He was Senator Harry Truman. And that is Harry Truman from the life, or the senator from Pendergast from the life of Harry Truman. For more Presidential Chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com. Don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.